Hello, I'm Donna Williams. I'm going to be reading you part 9 from the book, Nobody Nowhere. Terry lived around the corner. She was older than I was and she was Italian. I was 8 when I first met her and she was 10. I used to watch her and she'd watch me watching her. I didn't know how to make friends, so I'd stand there calling this girl every 4-letter word I knew. As my mother had a huge vocabulary of swear words, I did this pretty well. Eventually, this girl would take to her feet and chase me for several blocks. I'd go away, but I'd be back again the next day to do it all again. One day she'd caught me. She was about to smash my face in, and she asked me why I tormented her so persistently for so long. "Wanted to be friends," I blurted out furiously. "You're mad," she said with disgust. "Why don't you just try and talk like normal people?" she said. She was into smoking, learning new swear words, talking about boys, and interested in my older brother. I wanted somewhere to go, something to do, and to be free of the constant accusation that Donna has no friends. She'd take me to the Hogan's backyard. They owned this wood yard, and we'd sit among the wood. I was 8 years old. She put a cigarette in my mouth and light it. I'd cough, choke, and eventually learn to smoke cigarettes as I learned to be Terry. She found this amusing, and I was probably the cheekiest and rudest thing she'd ever met. My little brother and I went about swearing and defying everything. Terry would go inside for lunch. I'd sit, legs dangling in the gutter, glaring defiantly at her house from across the road. I never felt I was missing out on lunch because I rarely felt hunger. But the only thing I was missing out on was inclusion. But I wanted this on my own terms. So I was obsessive about my friendship with Terry as I was about any friendship. Friendships, if anything, had to be exclusive and excluding, purely one-to-one. If other children were included, I either took the stage or most often just bowed out. Terry had now become my world. We spent almost every available moment together, playing with her cats, collecting bits from garbage collections, taking trains and buses out to explore different suburbs. Terry's mother liked me, and I was Terry's excuse for getting out of housework and for looking after the younger children. As I had echoed English, now I echoed Italian. Standing in the front yard of their house, I would parrot the commands that the mother gave the children, with the mother's inflection and pronunciation. At home there was this constant war raging around me, and my father was living in the fast lane. Every step he took in independence was like another footprint of a mother's face. When he came home, there was war, and then it got worse, because his version of a compromise was to set this fast lane on a collision course with the front door of our own house. And so the house became this hum of constant drunken parties and the ensuing brawls. I'd always accepted my mother's violence towards me. Somehow it didn't seem to matter that much. After all, it was only my body. And in some perverse way, it's as if the extremes were the only physical sensation that I could feel without feeling hurt. Gentleness, kindness, and affection were much harder to make sense of. They were irritating and I found them uncomfortable. My mother used to say, if you really want to hurt someone, be nice to them. And perhaps she'd learned that lesson from watching the way it affected me. I decided I would go and live at Terry's house. I sat and wait until 1 o'clock in the morning, and then I'd sneak out, leaving the door unlocked so that I could sneak back in by 6 a.m. before anyone woke up. Around at Terry's, I'd creep quietly around the back, where I'd throw stones at her bedroom window in the way that she'd shown me. And she'd let me in. I'd climb up onto the top bunk with her, and secure with this 10-year-old mother, I'd fall asleep. Waking up at dawn was no problem. I always had. One night, Terry's mother was waiting to greet me at the back door. I was petrified. She looked terribly stern, and I thought, no, she's going to send me back home. Her daughter stood beside her looking guilty, and from Italian the daughter translated. My mother says that if you're going to come round here to sleep, you must come at a decent hour so you won't wake the other children up. I was over the moon. I was so excited. I simply couldn't sleep. So finally, when I headed out of the door of my own place, I simply said, "Going to Terry's?" And every few nights I'd go back to my parents' house and lay rigidly in my bed in my pretty prison in the attic, staring at the ceiling until my mind would go to sleep. Shattered dreams and broken glass, echoes of a shattered past. Too many names strewn about, the kind that one can live without. They're the shadows here within that tear apart personality. It's hard to say whether the violence of my family made me the way I was. What I do know is I didn't replay their violence over and over in my mind until I was much older. Though I was pretty much a part of all of the violence, it's hard to tell whether I helped shape their situation or they helped shape mine. As a child, the things that disturbed me, the events that shattered the security of my own little world and caused me to play them out over and over again, were usually events to do with the disturbing nature of that which other people take for granted. The disturbing nature of kindness, how disturbing it is to have other people know you, understand you, try and love you. I could comprehend the actions of another person, particularly if they were extreme. Their motivations, expectations, particularly to do with the whole giving-receiving thing. But with violence, I felt like I understood where I stood. To call it the result of baser emotions must be true, because I found it easier to grasp. Niceness was more subtle, more confusing. Most children learn to welcome it, to accept it. By the time I realized that niceness was there, it came as this kind of disruption, and I was never quite prepared for it. Possibly such preparation closes love out, but I always panicked without the capacity to detach. I'd panic, and then I'd be in this state of shutdown, of shock, and people would try and comfort me, but the comforting then either really annoyed me or it hurt. I didn't feel like most children. When I was aware enough of the world around me, though, to notice my father's violence, it did hurt, because my father hardly ever laid a hand on me, but I was disturbed by the person that I saw he could be, and more than anything, I was torn apart by the terror and hysterics of the person who could most get through to me, my little brother. Regardless of what else he'd do, the most disturbing thing that my father did was the noise and the sound of smashing glass in the house. See, the house seemed full of these colours and everything seemed to move too fast to make out, but I'd always make all the right moves when there was the middle of the war. I suppose it's like a person in a state of shock who doesn't remember how, but functions with great ability. As the colours and the things and people would fly, doors would get kicked in and sometimes faces would turn. But it was never like whole people. It was like it was happening to all their pieces. And the pretty things that got smashed, they seemed to be the greatest tragedy, a greater tragedy than what was happening to the people. It was like symbolic. The beauty was being smashed. The order was being smashed. And I could comprehend that. Tom would scream, and my face, as his mirror, I'd scream. No sound would come out from me, though. I'd pick up my little brother and get into the cupboard, my hands cupped over his mouth, my arms closing out the sound from his ears, and I'd feel his tears and his runny nose over my hands, and my hands were dry. It was as though he made me feel emotions, and he still had the decency to express them for me. More than anything else, my little brother frightened me by making me feel so here, so real. So I began to reject Tom. I'd become his whole world. And whenever I left him, he would cling to my leg, crying, no, Da, please don't go. So I would walk with him, clinging, dragging along, sobbing like a dead weight. And no matter what I said, he'd take it to heart. And perhaps it was the first time that anyone had taken me seriously. So Tom now began to sleep with the dog, a 3-year-old boy curled up with his bottle on a flea-ridden rug with a male Great Dane for his mother. And now it was as though I had died. 2 years later, the dog went. And then it was as though Tom had died at the same time.